attendance, and we're very excited to have Andy Schock here to present the 190-year history of the Catholic Church in New Riegel.
Well, thank you, Teresa. Thank you, everyone, for coming. As you said, I'm Andy Schock. I'm a lifelong resident of New Riegel, and like many people who have been there a while, your families have been there for generations. So I see a lot of familiar faces, and if you go through the graveyard, you'll see a lot of familiar last names, and you'll see that over and over and over. It's a very rich history in New Riegel in that regard. This year is the bicentennial year for Seneca County, and with that there is a driving tour, 19 stops, I believe. And there's more information over there on the table, 16 stops. So there's a lot of history throughout the county. It makes nice day trips, and a lot of things that maybe you haven't seen before. But with that, we will start with Catholic Church. And instead of just starting in New Riegel, we're going to start in the beginning of America. So there's actually the first diocese in the United States was just one. Everything east of the Mississippi was the Diocese of Baltimore. And at that time, there weren't actually a lot of Catholics in America. There's out of the estimated 4 million people in the new United States, only 30,000 were Catholic. So less than 1%. Most people, because they were descendants from England, they were probably from the Church of England, which broke away from the Catholic Church at one point. West of the Mississippi, you see Louisiana Territory, which then was purchased in 1803. Louisiana Territory actually stretches down across the panhandle of Florida and Florida itself. That whole area was the Diocese of New Orleans. The Pope and the King of Spain at the time decided to make that New Orleans, but then France ended up taking that over, and that's how America purchased it from Napoleon. Above that, you have the Diocese of Quebec, and the French were there since, I believe, the 1650s. So as we see here on the slide, John Carroll was the first bishop, and that is where we get the John Carroll University, which is up in Cleveland. It's named after him. Only 35 Catholic priests for that entire area east of the Mississippi, which is just amazing to think about, that immense amount of area, only 35 priests. A few years later, as the country grew, Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803. There was more territory that was being settled and needed more leadership in the Catholic Church. So they broke up into a few more dioceses. You still have New Orleans there in the south. On the east, you have Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and the original Baltimore. And then you see that in the shaded blue, that is one diocese there, Bardstown, Kentucky. And you can see it covers areas all the way from Kentucky, Tennessee, across to Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Missouri, up to Wisconsin. A huge, huge area. And then, again, the lack of priests in that area. 10 priests to serve all those states, which is just amazing to think about. You have those people settling, and they could have gone their whole lives without seeing a priest. The Diocese of Cincinnati was created, and that covered Ohio, Michigan, and parts of Wisconsin. So that was in 1821. Father Finrick was the first bishop, and he traveled through the area 5 times throughout his 10 years. Now this was before cars, obviously, but it was even before the Erie Canal in the Miami Erie Canal. So a lot of this would have been done with wagons or stagecoach, horseback, or even walking. He probably didn't walk since he was the bishop, but a lot of the traveling priests would have had to have walked. And in that time, he realized that there was just a huge population of German-speaking people that didn't have a priest that could hear confessions in their native language, that could give mass in that language. I say German speaking because it wasn't just Germany in Europe. There was a German of Confederation of States, which was 39 different states. So you had a wide range, people who living in France, living in Switzerland, Lumberg, lots of different places who spoke German and other languages, but they would not have had a priest speaking that language for them. Later on, the Diocese of Cincinnati split. So this map can be a little confusing if you're looking at it straight on, but the whole state is the Diocese of Cincinnati in 1821. So then in 1847, it split right in the middle, a north and a south. It would have been Cleveland to the north and Cincinnati to the south. Later on then in 1868, Cincinnati split. So now we have three different dioceses in the state. The top portion is still all Cleveland. We have Cincinnati and Columbus. And then in 1910, Cleveland split, pretty much right down the middle. And that's how we have four different dioceses now in Ohio. So now we're narrowing it down to Seneca County. So Seneca County was formally formed in 1824. Big Springs Township is the southwesternmost township in that county. Prior to 1833, most of that township was actually an Indian reservation. The reservation was then removed. Those people were forced down into the Wyandotte County Reservation, and that land became available to be purchased. And that is when Anthony Schindler came from Germany, and he originally purchased 240 acres in different areas in the township. And then over the course of years, he either bought more or traded different parcels to kind of consolidate all the parcels together. And that actually increased to 360 acres. So he was a very prominent citizen, a farmer, and it would seem a savvy businessman. And with that, he was actually, his log cabin was where the first masses were held. Like I said, there weren't many priests. There weren't very many German-speaking priests. So in this area, vast wilderness of the Black Swamp area, they had neighbors visiting to hold mass there in the house. Now, there's no documentation to say if a priest came to their house, who's actually the celebrant for those masses, but it would have been in his log cabin for a time being. And then the Redemptorist priest came to visit. They were based out of Peru, which is actually a small area south of Norwalk, 5 miles south of Norwalk. And they visited, and that is when they decided to make St. Boniface Parish. So a 3-person committee was formed. Schindler sold 3 acres of the northern part of his land, and that is currently where the church sits now, in that area, in that 3 acres. They built a log cabin, and they purchased 3 more acres from the landowner just north of them, so it consolidated it to 6 acres. Now, what's interesting about this is the very bottom there, that family, the Bosmer family, the father had already passed away before they had sold the land. So it is presumed that he's actually buried on a family plot, and that would be where the cemetery is now. Though there is no headstone, there is no record of it, but it's presumed that that is where and why the cemetery is where it is now. Now there still isn't a New Riegel at this point. It is a wilderness. Most people remember that it's called Wolf's Creek at this point. You can see at the bottom of the slide. That's what you see in a lot of early documentation. But before that, documentation shows that it was called German settlement or Deutsch settlement. And in one baptismal record that is actually from St. Mary's in Tiffin, somewhere between St. Boniface and Tiffin, 4 infants were baptized on one day in an area called the Bush, which I'm assuming means out in the wilderness somewhere between the two areas. But I mean, for me, it's hard to fathom just how dense the forest would have been, and for an area to be nicknamed the Wolf's Creek, it really had to be quite the wilderness. So the Redemptorist priests that were the first ones in New Riegel, as I said, they were in a settlement, a religious community of Peru, which is 5 miles south of Norwalk, and that was their center. From there, they would travel to different areas and start missions. So they traveled to Sandusky and Fremont, then further south, Honey Creek, Melmore, McCutcheonville, obviously New Riegel. But at some point, friction developed between the priest and the congregation there. Records would show that as money came in for the parish, it was not always staying at the parish for the benefit of those individuals or for that parish. It was spent on spreading the word, making new missions. So there was a lot of tension there of where the money was actually going. And that happened a lot in the early church. They found that Irish immigrants really supported the priest, and then the priest could do what they wanted with the money, while German immigrants did not support the priest as much, but supported their church. So it's a point of contention in a lot of different parishes. I always found that interesting. It got so bad that they actually left. The Redemptorist priests left in 1839, and at the request of the bishop, they returned later. But it didn't last long. You can say it only lasted 2 more years before they left permanently. This is Father Chenhens, I believe it's pronounced. I plugged it into the computer to make sure it's close. But he was the kind of the head of the order, but there were other Redemptorist priests also that are listed there. And this is a picture of, I'm just going to say Father Lewis. I don't want to butcher his last name. But he was at St. Boniface Parish at some time, and then he actually was appointed into Washington, D.C. and founded St. Mary's Mother of God Parish, which still stands today. And he remained there until his death on June 9, 1882. So actually it would have been today, 142 years ago, he passed away. So with them leaving, with the Redemptorist priest leaving, that left a void that needed to be filled. And that was filled by the precious blood. But before we get there, we have to find out who the leader of the precious blood was. This is Father Francis de Sales Brunner. He was born Nicholas Joseph Brunner in Switzerland. His parents were moderately well off, very devout religious people. And he actually joined a Benedictine abbey in Maria Stein, Switzerland, when he was 14. A few years later, he became a novice, and he took the name Francis de Sales. In 1819, at the age of 24, he was ordained a Benedictine priest. That is not a typo. I know he said the precious blood came to New Riegel, but at this point of the story, he was a Benedictine priest, and he became a professor in theology and a master of the novices, which would have been educating people into the priesthood and into the missionary. And this was actually a quote that I had found from him. He wrote this, that he enjoyed the ministry, but feared contact with the outside world. He almost wanted to be totally shut off and staying inside the abbey. And he didn't feel that the Benedictines were strict enough observers of the rule. So at this point, he's there at the age of 24. After 10 years, he leaves the Benedictine order. He moves to France and he joins the Trappist monastery. And that would have been kind of what you think of in with the brown attire with the hood, and they have the rope on the waist, very modestly dressed. He was there for just a few years because the Second French Revolution happened, and all the non-French Trappists, remember he was born in Switzerland, all the non-native French